In ancient Athens, the word citizen didn't mean what it means today. You could be born, live, work, and die in the heart of the so-called cradle of democracy and still not count as a person. If you weren't male, free, and born from two Athenian parents, you were invisible. You could fight their wars, clean their homes, raise their children, even teach their future philosophers, but your voice meant nothing. It didn't matter how smart you were, how loyal, how virtuous, or how educated. Without the right blood, you were nothing more than a shadow walking among the chosen. If this journey through the raw and forgotten side of ancient Greece opened your eyes, don't leave without joining us. Hit that subscribe button and be part of a community that dares to question the polished version of history. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from? What time is it right now in your house? I'd love to know who's on the other side of the screen. Imagine growing up in a society where every right was locked behind your anatomy. A boy born in Athens was told from an early age that he was destined to vote, to debate in the agora, to lead armies and shape laws. His future was predetermined with pride and power. Meanwhile, a girl born in the same house, same parents, same food, same gods, was trained to be quiet, not to speak, not to question, not to think beyond the walls of her home. She belonged to her father, then to her husband, and never to herself. She would never vote, never own property, never be seen as fully human under the law. The city that worshipped logic and virtue built its greatness on this selective silence. Even among the men, it wasn't just about being male. You had to be pure Athenian, both parents legally recognized as citizens. A child with a foreign mother? Out. A man born elsewhere but who lived his whole life in Athens? Irrelevant. They called them medics, resident aliens who paid taxes and served in the military but were forbidden from owning land or participating in politics. These were the people who kept Athens running, while being locked out of everything that made Athens proud. It's like letting someone build your house but never giving them the key. And then there were the slaves. Not a few, hundreds of thousands. Slavery wasn't hidden in some dark corner of society. It was public, normalized, and considered essential. Enslaved men and women weren't just laborers. They were property with no identity. They could be punished, traded, abused, and discarded at will. No citizenship, no family rights, no name that mattered. Even the great philosophers, those who debated the soul, justice, and ethics, accepted slavery as a fact of nature. Plato wrote about ideal societies, but his utopia still had slaves. Aristotle, the great thinker of reason, claimed that some people were slaves by nature. The mind that could dissect logic and purpose couldn't imagine that dignity belonged to all. And this wasn't just an Athenian problem. Across the Greek world, the idea of who counts was always carved from exclusion. Spartan boys were trained from age 7 to be soldiers, but only if they passed brutal tests of strength and ancestry. Others were discarded, sometimes literally. In Sparta, babies deemed weak or deformed were left on mountaintops to die. This was the standard. Strength was purity, weakness was waste. What's most disturbing is how much of this selective citizenship was dressed in the language of virtue. They didn't say, you can't vote because you're poor. They said, you must be virtuous to vote. But only the wealthy had time to be educated. Only citizens had access to mentors. Only landowners could afford leisure. So the system wasn't just exclusive, it was rigged from the start. It was never about merit. It was about inheritance, control, and keeping power in the hands of the few. And yet, Athens sold itself to history as a beacon of democracy. It held trials in open spaces. It allowed male citizens to speak freely in assemblies. It even paid poor men to participate in the jury system. But while the world remembers the ideals, it often forgets the exclusions. For every man who raised his voice in the agora, there were dozens more who could only listen, or weren't allowed in at all. Freedom in Athens was a tailored suit. If it didn't fit you perfectly, you didn't get to wear it. This is where modern myths collide with ancient realities. We glorify the Parthenon, but not the backs that bled building it. We quote Socrates on justice, but ignore the slaves who brought him water. We honor the concept of democracy while forgetting that, in its birthplace, over 90% of the population had no vote. If democracy means rule by the people, the Greeks believed only a narrow sliver of humanity counted as the people. The truth is unsettling, especially because it echoes today. The idea that some lives matter more than others, that some voices deserve platforms while others deserve silence, isn't dead. We just wear it differently. The Greeks gave it togas and laurel wreaths. We wrap it in policies, borders, and algorithms, but the structure remains familiar, a privileged core surrounded by invisible pillars no one wants to see. And the question remains, how much of what we call progress is just a more sophisticated version of the same ancient exclusion? When we praise Greek civilization for inventing democracy, we must also confront the cost. A system that inspired the world was, at its heart, built on limitation, hierarchy, and brutal silence. And once you see that, it becomes impossible to look at their so-called greatness without hearing the voices they buried underneath it. In ancient Greece, A woman was not born a person. She was born a function. Before she could even speak, her life was already mapped out by expectations she never agreed to. She wasn't trained to think, to speak, to dream. She was trained to obey. Her worth was measured by the purity of her womb, the silence of her mouth, and her ability to produce legitimate sons. And while the temples of Athens stood tall, honoring the gods of wisdom, love, and war, the women who lived in their shadows were little more than breathing vessels, decorative, disposable, and contained. Marriage wasn't about love, it was a contract, a transaction between two men, the father and the husband, where the bride was the currency. Girls were often married off at 13 or 14 to men twice their age or older. She didn't know his name. She didn't choose him. She didn't have to. Her role was fixed: marry, bear sons, and remain invisible. She entered her husband's home as a stranger and was expected to blend into the background like a piece of elegant furniture, something to be looked at, but not heard. Inside the house, she was confined to the gynaeceum, a private area where she cooked, wove, raised children, and stayed out of sight. Public spaces were for men: forums, theaters, gymnasiums. These were arenas of thought and action. Women belonged behind curtains. If she was seen too often outside, questions arose. Was she faithful? Was she modest? Was her husband too weak to control her? Her movement through the city could stain a man's reputation, not hers, because she had none to begin with. Education? Reserved for males. Athenian boys were taught rhetoric, philosophy, music, and science. Girls were taught to be silent. They learned how to weave, how to serve, how to walk without drawing attention. Even when a woman came from a noble family, her upbringing focused on submission. Her highest ambition was to marry well and give birth to a healthy male heir. Intelligence was dangerous in a woman, curiosity a threat. Even reading was frowned upon unless it related to domestic duties or religious rituals. But here's the brutal irony. While Athenian women were hidden, erased, and silenced, goddesses were everywhere. Athena, goddess of wisdom, stood in marble glory at the heart of the city. Artemis, fierce and independent, guarded the wild. Hera ruled Olympus as queen of the gods. The divine feminine was worshipped, but mortal women were shackled. It was mythology without empathy. They revered the idea of the powerful woman, as long as she wasn't real. This disconnect ran deep. In tragedy and theater, women were portrayed as passionate, wild, and dangerous, symbols of chaos when left unchecked. Medea, who kills her children in a rage. Clytemnestra, who murders her husband. Antigone, who defies the king and is buried alive. These were warnings, not tributes. They told men what could happen when a woman steps outside her place. The message was clear: keep her inside. Keep her quiet. Keep her under control. Even sex was not her own. Her body belonged to her father, then her husband, and always to the laws of the city. A woman could be accused of adultery without evidence. She could be divorced with a word. But if she was raped, the shame was hers to carry. The law wasn't concerned with her trauma. It was concerned with who owned her. The crime was not violation. It was trespass. And yet, in this world of suffocating rules, women still existed. They found ways to express, to resist, to endure. Some became priestesses, serving in religious roles that gave them limited public authority. Others found rare education through family connections or secret learning. The hetairae, elite courtesans, were paradoxically some of the most educated women in Greek society. Unlike wives, they could attend symposia, engage in philosophical debate, and influence powerful men. But they were also sexualized and marginalized, living in the narrow space between reverence and ruin. Women's lives were also shaped by motherhood. Giving birth was both sacred and deadly. Without modern medicine, pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous, often fatal. Stillbirths, infections, hemorrhages, these were common. A woman might die bringing life, and if she bore a daughter, it wasn't celebration, it was disappointment. Daughters meant more mouths to feed and more dowries to pay. Sons carried the name, the legacy, the citizenship. Daughters were burdens disguised in silk, and through it all, women were constantly watched, not just by their families, but by neighbors, by the law, by society itself. There was no privacy, no true freedom, no right to say no. Every decision, what to wear, where to walk, when to speak, carried risk. Honor was fragile. One rumor could ruin a life. Respectability was a mask that had to be worn at all times, even if it suffocated you. But the real wound, the one that still bleeds through history, is how normalized it all was. No one questioned it. Philosophers justified it. Dramatists romanticized it. Priests sanctified it. And generations of women endured it, some without complaint, others with quiet fire, but none with true freedom. Today we look back at the Greeks with admiration, their art, their architecture, their philosophy. But beneath the marble, there were cages. Behind the poetry, there were screams no one heard. And in the silence of those homes, elegant, structured, orderly, there were lives fading away without ever being lived. You've heard the names: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, giants of thought, fathers of philosophy, timeless voices echoing through centuries. But what you rarely hear is this: They lived and wrote in a world where most people didn't make it to 30. Their ideas about ethics, purpose, politics, and reason were born in a city filled with disease, decay, and premature death. Behind the elegant marble columns and well-spoken dialogues, there were corpses in the streets. Philosophy, it turns out, was crafted in the constant shadow of rotting flesh. In ancient Athens, life expectancy was brutal, not because of war, though there was plenty, but because of everything else. Typhoid fever, dysentery, tuberculosis, malaria, parasites, sepsis. These weren't rare occurrences. They were everyday killers. Most infants didn't survive their first year. If you were lucky enough to reach childhood, the next threats came from contaminated water, open sewage systems, animal waste, and wounds that refused to heal. A simple scratch could become an amputation. A fever could mean death by the end of the week. And if you made it to your 20s, you were considered seasoned. By 30, your body was already aging, and your friends were likely gone. That's the backdrop of Plato's Republic. That's the world where Aristotle wrote Nicomachean Ethics. These weren't ivory tower musings of men with long, safe lives. They were desperate attempts to make sense of human existence while watching people around them drop like flies. It wasn't a coincidence that Greek philosophy focused so much on death, virtue, and the meaning of a good life, because you could lose yours at any moment. Socrates himself died at 70, a miracle in his time, but it wasn't from illness, it was execution. Forced to drink hemlock after being convicted of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. But the truth is, he'd already survived several plagues, wars, and political purges. His corruption was asking too many questions in a society that couldn't answer its own decay. When death is so close and so common, asking what makes life meaningful becomes dangerous because you might not like what you discover. Take the great Athenian plague of 430 BCE. It hit during the Peloponnesian War and wiped out tens of thousands, a quarter of the city's population. No one knew what it was. Some historians now believe it could have been typhoid fever, Ebola, or a hemorrhagic virus. The symptoms were horrific: vomiting, fever, bleeding from every orifice, uncontrollable diarrhea, and rapid death. Survivors were often disfigured or blinded. The city was so overwhelmed that corpses were left in the streets, eaten by dogs or burned in mass pyres. Law collapsed. Morality disintegrated. People stole, raped, murdered, and abandoned their own families. Thucydides, who lived through it, wrote that people died like sheep. In that same era, philosophical schools were forming. The Academy, the Lyceum, the Cynics, the Stoics. Their lectures happened just outside the stench of death. This wasn't peaceful reflection, it was mental survival. Philosophy became a response to the absurdity of life and the certainty of suffering. The Stoics in particular, like Epictetus and later Marcus Aurelius, took the chaos and transformed it into clarity. They preached detachment, resilience, and the discipline of the soul. When your brother dies from a splinter, detachment isn't an intellectual game, it's a shield. And yet, most of the thinkers we quote today were from privileged classes. They had access to tutors, scrolls, safe water, and sometimes even doctors. Their perspective was elevated, not because they were better, but because they were luckier. They were the ones who survived long enough to write, to think, to influence. The wisdom of the ancient world comes not from the majority who died quietly, but from the minority who outlived disaster. Their ideas endured, but so did their blind spots. Few philosophers spoke about medical hygiene or public health. Few acknowledged the agony of childbirth, the brutality of disease, or the trauma of constant loss. They intellectualized suffering, but rarely lived where it hit hardest. In the slums, among the sick, next to the decaying, their world was burning, and they debated whether the soul was immortal. Still, there's a strange beauty in it. In the face of plague and political collapse, they asked the most essential questions. What is justice? What is love? What is the soul? What is courage when your city is dying? It's easy to judge them from the safety of modern medicine. But they were writing while coughing blood. They were teaching while friends died mid-sentence. They were dreaming of virtue while watching their world rot. And maybe that's why their words still resonate. Because deep down, we still fear the same things. Death, loss, meaningless pain. We still want to believe in purpose. We still reach for something greater than ourselves when everything falls apart. Philosophy, at its core, was never about answers. It was about surviving with dignity. Even the schools they created were not protected from the same fragility they tried to transcend. The academy eventually fell. The scrolls were burned, stolen, or lost. Many of their ideas were erased or distorted by those who came after. The ancient world was always teetering on the edge of infection, of war, of ignorance. And yet, they built systems of thought so powerful that we still study them today, hoping they'll help us make sense of a modern world that feels just as broken. Their minds reached for immortality in a world where their bodies never stood a chance. In ancient Greece, the gymnasium was not just a place for training the body. It was a stage for philosophy, politics, desire, and discipline, and it smelled like sweat, oil, spit, and ambition. Imagine a space filled with naked male bodies, oiled and gleaming under the Mediterranean sun, running, wrestling, debating, and coughing all at once. This wasn't a sanitized modern health club. It was a raw public display of masculinity, intellect, and sometimes disease. In the same place where Plato lectured about the soul, you could catch a parasite or get punched in the face. And yet, this chaotic arena was the heartbeat of Greek culture. To the Greeks, nudity wasn't shameful. It was essential. The word gymnasium literally comes from gymnos, meaning naked. Male nudity symbolized purity, equality, and ideal form. Clothes were seen as barriers to truth. In the gymnasium, stripped of class markers and ornamentation, a man's strength and grace became his credentials. Muscles were proof of discipline, symmetry was seen as a sign of moral balance, and physical training was considered preparation for civic duty. The body was not separate from the mind. It was its companion, its proof of virtue. A weak body implied a weak soul, but this idealized vision masked a strange and messy reality. These public spaces were often overcrowded, loud, and riddled with unsanitary conditions. There were no showers, no plumbing, no deodorant. Men trained, debated, and relieved themselves within the same complex. After intense exercise, they scraped sweat and dirt from their bodies using a curved metal instrument called a strigil, and then reused the oil for other purposes, sometimes even selling it. Yes, used sweat oil was a commodity. That same residue, called gloios, was believed to have medicinal or magical properties. People paid for it. They believed it could heal wounds, increase virility, and even enhance athletic performance. The very filth of greatness was considered sacred. Philosophers mingled among the athletes. Socrates was famous for engaging young men in deep conversations during or after physical training. The gymnasium wasn't just for biceps. It was where moral dilemmas were debated, political strategies were argued, and students were recruited for schools of thought. You could be doing push-ups one minute and discussing the nature of justice the next, while a half-naked wrestler grunted beside you and someone spit on the floor nearby. If this journey through the raw and forgotten side of ancient Greece opened your eyes, don't leave without joining us. Hit that subscribe button and be part of a community that dares to question the polished version of history. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from? What time is it right now in your house? I'd love to know who's on the other side of the screen. And let's talk about those bodily fluids. Hygiene as we understand it today didn't exist. People spat frequently, blew their noses into the dirt, and defecated in public latrines with little privacy. The gymnasium, despite its role as a center of excellence, was also a place of casual contamination. Shared sandals, infected wounds, open blisters. Disease had endless invitations. Yet few questioned this. The Greeks saw physical hardship as a pathway to glory. To suffer was to refine the soul. If you caught a rash while wrestling, it meant you were engaged in the noble pursuit of arete, excellence. But the gymnasium was also a theater of power and desire. These were male-only spaces, filled with young boys and older men in close physical proximity. Pedagogical relationships often blurred into erotic ones. In Athens, the concept of pederasty, a socially acknowledged relationship between an older man and a teenage boy, was embedded in the gymnasium culture. These bonds were seen as mentorship, but often carried a deeply sexual undertone. The older man was expected to teach philosophy, war, and civic duty. The boy, in return, offered companionship, and sometimes more. In today's terms, these dynamics would raise serious ethical alarm bells, but in ancient Greece, they were seen as vital to male development. At the same time, the gymnasium was a place of exclusion. Women were not allowed. Their presence would have shattered the male-centric balance, disrupted the supposed purity of focus. Female bodies were considered private, shameful, or too distracting. While men bared their forms under the sun, women remained behind closed doors, unseen, their bodies hidden like secrets. So while the gymnasium was a celebration of human form and intellect, it was only a celebration for half the population. The other half was erased from the scene entirely. This cult of the body extended beyond the gymnasium. Greek statues immortalized the male physique, not just as art, but as ideology. Every chiseled torso carved in marble was a moral lesson. The message was clear: strength equals virtue. The body must be tamed, controlled, sculpted, or it was unworthy. Fatness, disability, or asymmetry were associated with laziness, corruption, or weakness. A philosopher with a limp or a scarred athlete could become the butt of jokes and public plays. Even beauty had moral weight. And yet, in all this obsession with bodily perfection, most Greeks lived with chronic illnesses. Malnutrition was common, especially among the poor. Parasites from water and meat ravaged their systems. Broken bones, infected cuts, fungal diseases, these were daily battles. But those who suffered most weren't in the gymnasium. They weren't debating with Plato. They were outside the walls, hauling stones, cooking food, dying young. The public face of Greek glory was always polished, but its foundation was always rotting. Still, for those who had access, the gymnasium was sacred. It was where reputations were made, alliances were formed, and ideas were tested. It was noisy, brutal, intimate, and intellectual. a place where the sweat of the body met the spark of the mind. And in this place of contradictions, elegance and filth, intellect and instinct, freedom and hierarchy, the Greeks shaped a culture that would outlive them. They believed that training the body was training the soul, but they rarely asked whose soul was being trained and at what cost. In ancient Greece, drinking water could kill you, literally. What flowed through the city's fountains and wells was often laced with sewage, animal waste, decomposing matter, and invisible parasites. There were no purification systems, no chlorine, no understanding of bacteria or viruses. The concept of invisible pathogens wouldn't arrive for another 2 millennia. But the Greeks knew something wasn't right. People who drank straight water got sick. So they did something both ingenious and disturbing. They mixed it with wine. Yes, wine. The fermented blood of the grape, strong and sacred. It wasn't just for pleasure or ritual. It was a survival mechanism. The alcohol in the wine killed some of the bacteria in the water, making it marginally safer to drink. The mixture was typically 3 parts water to 1 part wine, though ratios varied depending on the occasion, the wealth of the host, or how desperate the drinker was. To us, it sounds like a cocktail. To them, it was public health. But here's the irony. The Greeks looked down on those who drank wine straight. That was considered barbaric. Unmixed wine was for the uncivilized, the Scythians, the Thracians, the Persians. To sip undiluted alcohol was seen as indulgent, dangerous, and animalistic. A proper Athenian man diluted his wine, sipped slowly, and held his cup with philosophical poise. He could drink all night, so long as he maintained dignity. But beneath that cultural mask, they were all just trying not to die of dysentery. Wine wasn't just consumed, it was central to social life. At symposia, male-only drinking parties, men gathered in reclined positions, surrounded by music, conversation, food, and sometimes sex. These were not wild bacchanals, at least not initially. The goal was to drink, but with discipline. The host determined the mixing ratio. A slave would fill the crater, the communal mixing bowl, and pour the wine-water mixture into individual cups. Conversations would flow about politics, war, poetry, and the gods. Philosophers used these gatherings to test arguments, make alliances, and seduce minds. And while their bodies remained still, their tongues raced toward intoxicated insight. Yet the more the wine flowed, the blurrier the boundaries became. Moderation gave way to laughter, then to shouting, and sometimes to violence. The Greeks even had a term for a state of drunken madness, kykion. When the symposium lost its structure, chaos entered. The same man who had recited Homeric verses at dinner could be vomiting in the courtyard an hour later. The Greeks knew this, and yet they returned to the cup night after night. Because it wasn't about pleasure, it was about control. Drinking was a ritual of self-mastery, until it wasn't. Even children drank wine. There was no drinking age because there was no safe water. A child might sip a diluted version from an early age, especially during festivals or religious ceremonies. For the Greeks, wine was a symbol of civilization. Dionysus, the god of wine, wasn't just a party deity. He was the god of ecstasy, madness, fertility, and rebirth. His presence blurred the line between control and chaos. And in a world where death could arrive at any moment, maybe that blur felt like freedom. Still, wine had its own risks. Vineyards could be contaminated. Storage vessels made of clay or skin often carried mold, insects, or chemicals like lead. The Greeks sweetened wine with honey, flavored it with herbs, and sometimes even added seawater or pine resin. The result was a thick, pungent drink that varied wildly in quality. Some wines were revered, others were barely tolerable, but people drank them anyway, because the alternative was to gamble with every sip of water. The daily struggle for hydration shaped their worldview. Thirst wasn't just a sensation, it was a threat. Wells could dry, rain could fail, drought could destroy entire harvests. The scarcity of clean water meant that whoever controlled the sources held real power. Springs were sacred. Nymphs were believed to guard them. Fountains were dedicated to the gods. And when an army invaded, one of the first things they targeted was the enemy's water supply. And yet, the Greeks built fountains and public baths. They constructed aqueducts and channels to carry water into their cities. They had engineers who designed drainage systems and cisterns. For all their limitations, they tried to harness water, to tame the very thing that both gave and took life. But the technology was primitive. In times of war or plague, it collapsed. Contaminated wells became weapons. Public latrines overflowed. Disease spread faster than news. Still, water and wine remained intertwined with identity. To drink water was to risk death. To drink wine was to embrace control, to join a ritual older than memory. Even in temples, libations were poured not of water, but wine, offerings to the gods to purify, to protect, to connect. Every drop carried meaning, every cup a fragile promise. But what does it say about a civilization when survival depends on intoxication, when the very thing that symbolizes wisdom, the symposium, the philosopher's cup, is laced with desperation? The Greeks praised moderation but lived on the edge of excess. They built statues of perfection while their guts twisted from parasites. They drank to stay alive and called it divine. And perhaps nowhere was this contradiction more clear than in the way they governed themselves. Because while wine blurred their nights, daylight revealed another kind of illusion, one called democracy. And like their sacred drink, it too was diluted, carefully mixed, reserved for those who knew how to hold their cup the right way, in the right room, among the right men. Ready to see how that worked? When people say democracy began in ancient Greece, they usually mean Athens. And when they say democracy, they imagine what we have now: voting rights, representation, equality. But the truth is far more complicated and far less flattering. Because in Athens, only about 1 in 10 people could actually vote. The rest? They built the temples, harvested the olives, raised the children, fought the wars, cleaned the streets, and carried the weight of society, all without a voice. The cradle of democracy, it turns out, was also a fortress of exclusion. Let's break it down. To be a citizen in Athens, the kind that could vote, own land, and participate in political life, you had to meet a very specific list of criteria. First, you had to be a man. Women were out. Second, you had to be free. Not a slave, not an indentured servant, not a prisoner of war. Third, both your parents had to be Athenian citizens. Not just your father, not just your mother. Both. If your mother was a foreigner, too bad. If your father was a traveling merchant from another city-state, sorry. Even if you lived your whole life in Athens, paid taxes, served in the army, raised a family, if your bloodline didn't meet the standard, you were invisible. This meant that medics, resident foreigners, were excluded. So were freed slaves who remained legally inferior even after gaining freedom. Women, no matter how educated or wealthy, had no political status. And, of course, the vast population of slaves, who made up roughly a third of Athens' total inhabitants, had no rights at all. In fact, in some estimates, slaves outnumbered citizens. So when we imagine Socrates or Pericles standing in the agora speaking to the people, we should remember that the people was a very small club. The Athenian democracy was direct, meaning that eligible citizens voted personally on laws, war decisions, and public matters. They didn't elect representatives. They gathered, debated, and voted themselves. In theory, this meant pure civic participation. In practice, it meant that a small group of educated, wealthy men controlled the fate of everyone else. Assembly meetings could draw thousands, but they were dominated by those who had the time, education, and resources to attend regularly. Poorer citizens might be too busy working or too intimidated to speak. To encourage broader participation, Athens even paid a small wage for attending the assembly or serving on a jury. But this was a fragile solution to a deeper problem. Access didn't equal influence. Eloquence mattered. Reputation mattered. Connections mattered. If you were a fisherman from Piraeus with a thick accent and rough manners, good luck trying to pass a motion. Meanwhile, someone like Alcibiades, wealthy, charismatic, scandalous, could shape public opinion with a few well-placed words and a dazzling smile. It wasn't just democracy, it was performance. And then there was ostracism, a practice where citizens could vote to exile someone from the city for 10 years without trial. It wasn't used often, but when it was, it revealed the dark side of Athenian politics. If you were too powerful, too popular, or simply inconvenient, you could be cast out by public vote. It was a safety valve against tyranny, but also a weapon of jealousy and manipulation. The same democracy that gave you a voice could silence you with a shard of pottery. Literally, that's what they used: ostraca, broken pieces of clay with names scratched into them. What's more, not all political offices were open to the citizens, and many were assigned by lottery, not election. The idea was to avoid corruption and favoritism, but it also meant that leadership was sometimes a roll of the dice. A man could wake up a farmer and go to bed a city magistrate. In some ways, this was brilliant. In others, it was reckless. Would you trust your tax system to someone whose only qualification was luck? Yet for all its flaws, Athenian democracy was revolutionary. It was the first system in recorded history to place power in the hands of ordinary citizens, even if only a few. It introduced the idea that rulers should be accountable, that laws should be public, that debate should shape decisions. It wasn't equality, it wasn't fairness, but it was a spark, a dangerous, imperfect, beautiful spark, and it didn't last. Athens' democracy was constantly under threat, from war, from internal corruption, from shifting public opinion. During the Peloponnesian War, democracy was suspended, an oligarchy took control, then democracy returned, then it fell again. The system was fragile because it rested on the belief that citizens would act with reason and virtue. But people are rarely so consistent. Emotions ran high. Demagogues rose. The assembly could be swayed by fear, by revenge, by bribes. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle eventually criticized democracy, calling it chaotic and dangerous. They saw how easily the mob could become the master. And still, centuries later, we look back at Athens with admiration. We cite it as the birthplace of liberty. But real liberty, for most people, didn't exist. It was liberty for the educated, the connected, the native-born male. The rest watched from the margins, or didn't live long enough to watch at all. This selective democracy was mirrored in everything the Greeks built, from the temples that only men could enter, to the theaters that excluded female actors, to the festivals that celebrated the polis while ignoring those who made it possible. It was a city built on division, defended by myth, and celebrated by the few who were allowed to speak. But beneath that civic theater, there was another foundation, one darker, dirtier, and far more essential. Because while citizens argued about justice in marble halls, someone else was digging trenches, scrubbing floors, and serving wine. Someone who would never vote, never be heard, never be free. They never appear in the statues. They never speak in the plays. Their names were rarely recorded, and when they were, it was often as property. But without them, Athens would have collapsed. Its temples, its debates, its glory. None of it could have existed without slaves. Not just a few, not a hidden minority. Slavery was everywhere, visible, foundational, and normalized. 1 in 3 people in ancient Athens was a slave. That's not a footnote. That's the engine. Slaves in ancient Greece didn't belong to one race or ethnicity. They came from all over. Thrace, Lydia, Syria, Egypt, the Balkans. Some were prisoners of war, others victims of raids, piracy, or debt. Some were even born into slavery within Greek households. There was no universal condition of slavery. Some worked in mines under horrific conditions, dying young and nameless. Others managed households, educated children, or kept financial records. A few could even become trusted assistants to philosophers or statesmen. But no matter their task, one fact remained the same. They were property. The silver mines of Laurion, southeast of Athens, were among the worst places a human could end up. Slaves there worked in narrow shafts, sometimes just inches high, in complete darkness, breathing toxic dust, chained and often barefoot. They were children, teenagers, men with no hope. Life expectancy was horrifyingly short. The profits from these mines funded Athens' war efforts, public buildings, and democratic experiments. Every shimmering coin minted by Athens carried the invisible weight of their suffering. Inside Athenian homes, domestic slaves lived among the family but outside their humanity. They fetched water, prepared food, cleaned, tended fires, helped raise children. They were always there, present but never acknowledged as equals. A mistress might confide in a female slave, but that trust ended at the property line. If the slave displeased her master or his wife, she could be beaten, sold, or killed with little consequence. The law rarely intervened unless the act disrupted public order. The slave's body was not her own. Neither was her labor, neither was her fate. Some slaves were public property. They worked for the state, managed records, or performed specialized tasks. These included city clerks, street sweepers, and even police officers. Yes, Athens had a rudimentary police force composed entirely of slaves, mostly Scythians. They carried whips and enforced order in the assembly and public gatherings. The irony is stunning. In the so-called birthplace of democracy, the crowd was managed by people who could never participate in it. And still, this system was so entrenched that even the greatest minds of the time accepted it without question. Aristotle argued that some people were slaves by nature. To him, they lacked the rational soul necessary for freedom. Slavery wasn't just tolerated, it was philosophically justified. These were not fringe ideas. They were central to Greek thought. Even Plato, who wrote of ideal societies, envisioned a structured world with strict roles and no path to equality for all. Freedom was not considered a universal right. It was a status you were either born into or lucky to receive. On rare occasions, a slave could be freed, either as a reward for loyal service or through purchase. But even then, their life was limited. Freed slaves, known as freedmen, had no political rights. They couldn't vote, own land in most cases, or marry into citizen families. They existed in a legal limbo, not property, but not quite people. Greek comedies often mocked slaves, portraying them as sneaky, foolish, or cowardly. But the reality was far more complex. Slaves had to be clever. Their survival depended on reading moods, predicting danger, anticipating demands. A misstep could lead to punishment, humiliation, or death. Humor became a mask. Obedience became a performance. And any sign of rebellion had to be silent. A cracked cup left out of place, a task completed too slowly, a look held a second too long. And yet, for all their suffering, slaves built the Greek miracle. They laid the stones of the Acropolis. They cleaned the blood from battlefields. They raised the children who would grow up to become philosophers and generals. Their hands touched every corner of Athenian life, even as their names were scrubbed from history. When Pericles gave his famous funeral oration praising the greatness of Athens, no one stood up for the slaves who made that greatness possible. They had no voice to speak, no grave to mark, no freedom to mourn. This wasn't unique to Athens. Across the Greek world, in Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, slavery was routine. In Sparta, the Helots were an entire class of enslaved people, native to the land, forced to farm for their Spartan overlords. They outnumbered the Spartans and lived under constant surveillance and oppression. Every year, the Spartans declared ritual war on them, legally allowing for murder without consequence. This wasn't slavery as an unfortunate byproduct. It was institutionalized terror. But here's the hardest part. The system worked. For centuries. It made Athens rich, powerful, and influential. It allowed the upper class to explore philosophy, politics, art, and leisure, while others carried the burden of survival. And because it worked, no one had a reason to question it. Slavery was seen as natural, necessary, even divine. To dismantle it would have been to dismantle the very fabric of Greek civilization, and so it endured. When we celebrate Greek democracy, art, or philosophy, we are also, whether we admit it or not, standing on a scaffold of suffering. The beauty was built on backs, the wisdom was written with borrowed breath, and the ideals that shaped the Western world were drafted in a world where some lives didn't count. But the contradictions didn't stop at slavery. Because even among those considered free, even among citizens themselves, there were battles over who belonged, who mattered, and what kind of body deserved to be seen. Let's now look at how Greek society turned aesthetic perfection into moral judgment, and how beauty itself became a weapon. In ancient Greece, beauty wasn't just admired, it was expected. It wasn't a personal trait, it was a moral standard. The symmetry of your face, the proportion of your limbs, the tone of your muscles, these weren't just physical attributes. They were seen as reflections of your soul. If you looked good, you were assumed to be good, disciplined, rational, virtuous. But if your body failed to meet the standard, if it was too soft, too thin, too heavy, too crooked, it wasn't just a flaw, it was a sign of inner corruption. The Greeks called it kalokagathia, the fusion of beauty, kalos, and virtue, agathos. This wasn't just a poetic phrase, it was a cultural law. It meant that to be truly good, you had to be beautiful. And if you weren't, you were automatically suspect. Physical deformity wasn't just unfortunate, it was a marker of moral weakness. A crooked back suggested a crooked mind. A scarred face hinted at a damaged soul. A fat stomach implied laziness, greed, or a lack of self-control. A man who couldn't maintain his body was assumed to be unable to maintain his character. Greek statues tell the story. Look at the kouroi. The young male figures carved in marble, stiff and symmetrical, muscles etched in ideal lines. They weren't portraits of real people. They were blueprints for human perfection. The same is true for depictions of gods. Apollo wasn't just wise or powerful, he was flawlessly beautiful. Aphrodite wasn't just the goddess of love, she was the embodiment of proportion and grace. To depict a god with physical flaws would have been unthinkable. The divine, in Greek thought, was beauty made eternal. But this obsession with form went beyond the divine. In everyday life, beauty had social consequences. A handsome man might receive better treatment in court. A well-built soldier was assumed to be more courageous. Attractive youths were given more attention, more praise, more opportunity, and they knew it. Young men spent hours in the gymnasium sculpting their bodies, not just for athleticism, but for admiration. Their appearance wasn't vanity, it was social currency. Public ridicule became a tool to enforce this standard. In the Athenian theater, especially in comedies by playwrights like Aristophanes, characters with physical flaws were mocked relentlessly. Hunchbacks, potbellies, baldness, and bad posture were not just funny, they were signs of ridicule-worthy failure. The audience laughed, not because deformity was rare, but because it was feared. Laughter became a shield, a way to distance oneself from the terror of not measuring up. And it wasn't just about men. While women were largely absent from the public sphere, their beauty was still judged, controlled, and commodified. A woman's value was directly linked to her appearance. A pale complexion signaled wealth and purity, since it meant she didn't work outdoors. A small mouth, high forehead, and symmetrical features were praised in poetry and sculpture. Aging, wrinkling, or weight gain were seen as signs of fading virtue. Even though women were hidden from public life, their bodies were still under constant cultural scrutiny, and their failure to meet the ideal could cost them marriage, status, or security. Greek doctors even participated in this aesthetic policing. Medical texts by Hippocrates and others described ideal body types and warned against deviations. A woman who was too thin might be barren. A man with narrow shoulders might lack vitality. Physical shape was pathologized, moralized, and dissected. The physician didn't just treat disease, he judged worth. Of course, there were exceptions. Socrates, for example, was famously ugly. He had a snub nose, a pot belly, and bulging eyes. But he used his appearance as a paradox, a shell that hid profound wisdom. His ugliness became part of his mystique. He flipped the cultural expectation, arguing that true beauty came from the soul. But even he was seen as an anomaly. His students often remarked on how strange it was that such a brilliant mind could live in such an unfortunate body. And this fixation on beauty wasn't passive. It created real psychological pressure. Ancient texts mention grooming rituals, dietary regimens, and even early forms of cosmetic surgery. Men removed body hair with pumice stones. Women used lead-based makeup to lighten their skin, despite its toxicity. People straightened their posture, adjusted their diets, and applied oils obsessively. Not for health, for image, to belong. to be seen as good, desirable, worthy. But underneath all of this was a deep fear, the fear of being grotesque, not just unattractive, but morally defective. And that fear permeated every layer of Greek life. From the statues they carved to the stories they told, from the way they punished difference to the way they worshipped perfection, the Greeks encoded beauty into their very concept of humanity. And in doing so, they excluded everyone who couldn't fit the mold. This obsession didn't end with personal aesthetics. It spilled into how they saw the world, into how they defined civilization, religion, and even justice. The Greeks believed that harmony in the body reflected harmony in the cosmos, that the ideal human form echoed the structure of the universe. And if your body broke that symmetry, maybe you didn't belong in the order of things. But life, of course, is not symmetrical. It is chaotic, painful, and unpredictable. And nowhere did that chaos reveal itself more clearly than in the rituals meant to keep it at bay. The ceremonies, the sacrifices, the desperate offerings to gods who were as jealous and violent as the people who worshipped them. And so, in the shadow of sculpted beauty and philosophical ideals, the Greeks built another world, one where blood was spilled, incense burned, and divine favor was bartered in fear. Would you like to step into that world? In a world obsessed with beauty, order, and philosophical reason, it's easy to forget that ancient Greece was also a deeply religious society, and that religion, for all its temples and poetic hymns, was driven by fear. The gods of Mount Olympus were not kind. They were not just. They were not even particularly wise. They were powerful, temperamental, and terrifyingly human in their flaws. And so, the Greeks didn't worship out of love. They worshipped out of anxiety. Their rituals weren't acts of devotion. They were negotiations, insurance, desperate attempts to keep chaos from consuming everything. To understand Greek religion, you have to let go of the idea of moral divinity. Zeus wasn't a benevolent father. He was a sky tyrant with a lightning bolt. He raped, lied, punished, and rewarded on whims. Hera was jealous and vengeful. Poseidon was moody and violent. Artemis was ruthless. Ares was bloodthirsty. These were not deities you trusted. They were forces you survived. And to survive, you had to feed them. Sacrifice was the cornerstone. Animals, especially bulls, goats, and pigs, were offered on stone altars in public ceremonies. Their throats were slit, their blood spilled, their bones burned, and their meat divided. The gods got the smoke. The people got the rest. It was both a sacred act and a communal meal. And while the smell of roasted flesh wafted through the agora, people whispered prayers, made promises, and begged the heavens for mercy. These sacrifices weren't symbolic. They were literal transactions. You gave the gods something valuable. A life, a portion of your harvest, a piece of your wealth, and in return, you hoped they would spare your crops, bless your voyage, or protect your child from fever. If they didn't, well, maybe you didn't give enough. Maybe the ritual wasn't pure. Maybe the priest made a mistake. Or maybe the god was just angry anyway. That's the thing. In Greek religion, there were no guarantees, only probabilities. Temples were everywhere, each one devoted to a specific god or goddess, each one requiring specific rituals, taboos, and offerings. Entering a temple meant observing strict rules. You had to be clean, free from sin, by their standards, and sometimes ritually bathed. Priests and priestesses oversaw the rituals, interpreting signs, reading omens, and deciding what the gods demanded. But they weren't moral leaders. They were intermediaries. And often, they were just as flawed, greedy, or corrupt as the politicians. Omens were a national obsession. Birds flying the wrong way, thunder at the wrong time, a goat trembling before sacrifice. Any of these could derail a military campaign, cancel a marriage, or delay a public vote. Augury, reading the flight of birds, and haruspicy, reading animal entrails, were treated as science. Leaders waited for favorable signs before making decisions, and if the signs were bad, everything stopped, even war. But despite all the rituals, the sacrifices, and the smoke that rose endlessly into the sky, the gods still punished. Plagues ravaged cities, earthquakes toppled temples, lightning struck ships, children died, and people still came crawling back to the altar, convinced they hadn't prayed hard enough. Religion wasn't comfort, it was pressure, it was constant vigilance, and nowhere was this more visible than in times of crisis. During the plague of Athens, there's a devastating epidemic that killed tens of thousands around 430 BCE. The temples overflowed with offering. Corpses piled up outside sanctuary. People sacrificed everything they had, but the gods didn't answer. The city fell into chaos. Social norms collapsed. People abandoned their families, looted homes, and defiled sacred spaces. It was as if the gods themselves had left, or worse, turned against the city. And still, Athenians kept praying, kept burning animals, kept hoping, because what else was there? Even festivals. The bright theatrical face of Greek religion were tinged with fear. The Dionysia, for instance, honored Dionysus, god of wine and ecstasy. It featured plays, parades, and communal drinking. But Dionysus wasn't just a fun party god. He was also the god of madness, possession, and chaos. His rites, especially in rural areas, involved wild dancing, animal dismemberment, and frenzied trance states. Worshippers claimed to be filled by the god, not metaphorically, but literally. They lost themselves in him, and sometimes they never came back. The Eleusinian mysteries, secret initiation rites dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, were another example of religion's double edge. Participants swore oaths never to reveal what happened inside. We still don't know the full details, but we know this. Initiates fasted, journeyed into darkness, and experienced something so profound that it transformed their understanding of life and death. It was spiritual, yes, but it was also terrifying. Not all who entered returned unchanged. Some didn't return at all. And if you broke the religious rules, if you defiled a temple, stole an offering, or mocked the gods, the consequences were brutal. Socrates himself was accused of impiety, corrupting the youth and disrespecting the city's gods. That's why he was sentenced to death. Not for treason, not for violence, for irreverence. In a society that claimed to love philosophy, challenging the divine order could still get you killed. This religious tension ran deep. The Greeks didn't separate the sacred from the secular. Everything was watched by the gods. Birth, sex, death, politics, farming, sailing, eating, all of it was spiritual territory. And because the gods were unpredictable, life was never secure. You could do everything right and still suffer. Or you could sin in secret and be blessed. There was no logic, just fate. And yet, this fear kept the culture in motion. It justified wars, shaped laws, and defined morality. It carved gods into marble and myths into the minds of generations. And through it all, the Greeks clung to their rituals like lifelines, not because they believed they were safe, but because they knew they weren't. But if the gods ruled the heavens, it was war that ruled the earth. And for the Greeks, war wasn't an interruption of peace, it was a natural state of being. In fact, in some cities, it was the very purpose of life. Shall we step into the blood-soaked soil of Sparta and beyond to see what happened when glory and violence became one and the same? War, for the ancient Greeks, wasn't a failure of diplomacy. It wasn't an unfortunate necessity. It was a way of life. Glory wasn't found in peace. It was earned on the battlefield. To die in war was not a tragedy. It was an ascension. And no place embodied this brutal ideal more perfectly than Sparta, a city-state built on discipline, violence, and unwavering loyalty to the state. In Sparta, you were born into war. You were trained for it. And if you didn't measure up, you were discarded. Literally. At birth, every Spartan child was examined by elders. Not for their spirit, not for their potential, but for their body. Any sign of weakness, deformity, or imperfection was grounds for death. The unwanted were taken to Mount Taygetus and left to die from exposure. No ceremony, no names, just silence and cold air. This was the first lesson in the Spartan code. The collective matters more than the individual. Only the strong deserve to live. Boys who passed this inspection began military training at the age of 7. They left their mothers and entered the agog, the brutal education system designed to strip away softness and forge soldiers. There were no toys, no luxuries, no comforting words. Only obedience, endurance, and pain. They learned to march barefoot, to sleep in the open, to steal food, and to be beaten if they were caught. The punishment wasn't for stealing. It was for failing. Failure in Sparta was a moral crime. Discipline was enforced with violence. Teachers used whips. Older boys dominated younger ones. Hunger was constant. Physical punishment was routine. Emotional expression was weakness. Friendship, if it developed, had to serve the purpose of cohesion in combat. The goal was not education. It was transformation, from child to weapon. By their teens, Spartan boys were expected to fight. Not in symbolic drills, but in actual combat or brutal survival tests. One infamous example was the Crypteia, a secret rite of passage where young Spartans were sent into the countryside at night to murder helots, the enslaved class, as a way to train them in stealth and instill terror among the oppressed. This wasn't a rumor, it was policy. Murder was a tool of social control, and it was institutionalized. Women in Sparta lived differently from their Athenian counterparts, but they too were defined by war. Unlike Athenian women, Spartan girls were educated, exercised publicly, and trained in strength. Why? Because strong mothers produced strong sons. Spartan women didn't weave. They ruled households, owned land, and expected their sons to return from battle either victorious or dead. The famous phrase, "with your shield or on it," wasn't metaphorical. It was a command. A Spartan who fled from battle brought dishonor to his family. A mother mourning a son who died bravely in combat held her head high. Grief was allowed, shame was not. But Sparta wasn't the only Greek city devoted to war. All of Greece was shaped by conflict. City-states were in a near-constant state of tension, forming alliances one year and breaking them the next. The Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta lasted nearly 3 decades and devastated the region. Thousands died. Cities were razed. Plagues spread. Democracies crumbled. And yet, the war is still remembered as a defining chapter of Greek greatness. Hoplite warfare, the dominant military strategy, was personal and terrifying. Soldiers stood in tight formations called phalanxes, shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, spears extended. There was no room to run, no space for individual heroism. You fought as a wall of flesh and bronze, advancing with brutal unity. The enemy was just a few feet away. You could smell his breath, hear his panic, feel the tremor in his shield. Victory came not from clever strategy, but from endurance. Who could push harder, longer, without breaking? The armor was heavy, the shields massive, the heat unbearable. And when the formations broke, and they always broke, the battlefield turned into chaos, slipping on blood-soaked dirt, hacking at limbs, trampling the wounded. There was no glory in those moments, just survival. And yet, poets like Tertius wrote verses glorifying the dead, praising those who fell in the front line covered in dust and blood. Because in Greek culture, the highest form of honor was not to live well, it was to die well. War was also a proving ground for leaders. Figures like Leonidas of Sparta, who died at Thermopylae with his 300 men, became immortal symbols of courage. Even the democratic Athenians idolized generals like Pericles, whose political power was inseparable from his military reputation. In times of peace, they built statues. In times of war, they built legends. But behind every victory was a shadow. The conquered were enslaved, their temples looted, their children taken. Cities like Melos were massacred for resisting Athenian domination, all in the name of strategic necessity. The Athenians, proud fathers of democracy, could be ruthless imperialists. The Spartans, defenders of honor, could be merciless tyrants. The Greeks spoke of honor and virtue, but war revealed their capacity for cruelty. Even the Olympic Games, the sacred festival that supposedly paused all hostilities, were born from warlike ideals. The Games celebrated physical dominance, national pride, and heroic endurance. Athletes trained like soldiers. Victors were rewarded like generals. The line between warrior and champion blurred until it disappeared. And when a soldier died, his funeral was public and political. His name was engraved, his family honored. His memory used to inspire the next generation. No one spoke of the trauma. No one mentioned the shattered limbs, the screams, the haunted eyes. The Greeks romanticized war, wrapped it in marble and myth, and called it glory, but the truth was far more human and far more brutal. And that's the final paradox of ancient Greece. A civilization that gave us philosophy, art, and democracy, but built it all on the back of violence, exclusion, fear, and death. They reached for the heavens with one hand and drew blood with the other. And in the echoes of their greatness, we still hear the clashing of swords and the silence of those who were never allowed to speak. Because maybe that's what made the Greeks so timeless. Not their perfection, but their contradictions. Their brilliance didn't come from purity. It came from tension, from the collision of light and shadow. And perhaps if we dare to look closely, we'll see our own world reflected in that shattered mirror, and finally ask ourselves, which parts of their legacy have we inherited? And which ones have we chosen to forget?